So this is a video lecture for the last section of the World War II unit entitled Europe and Japan in Ruins. This is our last slide from the previous lecture. The war in the Pacific had ended with the Japanese surrender after the use of atomic bombs. And obviously after that, there was some work to be done. So let's look at some of these things. All right, first of all, let's look at some numbers. Now, what do these numbers mean in terms of World War II? So 60 million represents those who were killed as a result of the war. All total, everybody. I mean, that's huge. That's hugely impactful. With 60 million people were there, and then after the war, they were not. 50 million represents those who were homeless as a result of the war. So that's difficult to take into account, how to help those people and what do those people do. And then 30 million of the 60, half of those who died in World War II were from the Soviet Union. And that's just because of their strategy, if you want to put that in air quotes, their strategy of overwhelming their enemy, not necessarily with strategy, with sophistication, but with numbers. Maybe we can't outmaneuver you, but we have more people than you do, and we will eventually win. All right, after World War II, with the newly created United Nations as the responsible party here, those Nazi leaders who either didn't flee to South America or didn't take their own lives, and Nazi leaders did both of those things, the ones that didn't and were caught were put on trial, and this was called the Nuremberg trials, which is interesting because if you remember the name of the laws that took rights away from Nazis in the beginning of Nazi Germany, they were called the Nuremberg laws. So these were called the Nuremberg trials. It's actually just because that was the city in Germany that the trials were in. This was a court, international court of individuals. There were judges from multiple countries. Each of these individuals had representation. They had a lawyer. They were put on trial. They could have just been executed, but I think the Allies wanted to make sure that they avoided the mistakes of World War I, and they didn't want to make these people martyrs. They wanted to hold them accountable in a way that wouldn't, lead to World War III, like what happened after World War I. Another thing that's interesting, you can see on some of these guys' heads, these little devices here. Today it's no big deal, but this was 1945. There was a company called IBM that developed these sophisticated headphones where all these different people from all these different countries and all these different languages, they could put on these headphones and they could hear what was being said in their own language. It was pretty amazing technology for the day. All right, a couple of individuals, let's focus in on some of them here. This is what they were charged with before we get to the individuals. They were charged with waging a war of aggression and crimes against humanity for various roles that they've participated in within the regime. All right, the two main guys, this is Rudolf Hess, assistant to the Fuhrer, high-ranking Nazi official, and Rudolf Hess. And then this guy here, Hermann Göring, who was kind of the leader of this group. He was super defiant all the way to the end. He actually multiple times spoke out and in defiance against what was going on to them in the trial and things. He was the most stubborn. He kind of inspired the rest of the individuals to be just as stubborn. And this guy right here was another individual. His name was Hans Frank, and he was responsible for the death of a lot of Polish people once the Germans went in there, rounding up Jews and things like that. But what's interesting is that he is the only Nazi in this entire group to show any amount of remorse. All the rest of them were stubborn until the end, saying that what was going on to them was unjust and they had no right to put them on trial, all kinds of things. Interestingly enough, these Nazis were found guilty and they were hung. That was the method of execution. And then, in a nice touch, I think it's kind of neat, is that the bodies of these Nazi leaders who were found guilty of the Nuremberg trials were taken to a concentration camp and cremated in the same ovens that they condemned so many people to. So I think that's kind of a neat symbolic act there. All right, back in the Pacific, another issue to deal with was what to do with Japan after World War II is over. It's a picture of General MacArthur here with the Japanese emperor. So the person put in charge of the transition of Japan from military dictatorship into whatever they were going to be after the war was MacArthur. He was a guy famous in this part of the world and respected in this part of the world, so it made sense. So a couple of changes to the position of the emperor that were made in Japan. The emperor was no longer considered divine. His will was no longer the law. His power was reduced. And he became a figurehead. So kind of like the royal family in Britain, they don't rule Britain, but they're really, historically significant and influential in things, and but they're not in charge in that sense. The Americans helped the Japanese set up this dual parliamentary system called a diet, and it was kind of like the United States, a two-house legislature where laws were passed. But they actually developed their whole system more along the lines of what the British system is like than the American system is like, which is kind of smart, because if you're trying to help a nation transition from one thing to another, to force them to do what you do might leave bitterness and resentment in there. So the relationship between the United States and Japan after World War II was protector, and they worked together. They were allies, which is interesting because the United States and Japan could have hated each other after World War II, but they have a good relationship today. And I think that's largely due to the fact of how the United States treated them after World War II. Not as a colony or someone to be punished, but we're going to help you transition from what you were to something else, because you can't be what you were before. All right, a couple of vocab terms here. Demilitarization, both of these apply to what happened in Japan. Reduction of a nation's army to an agreed minimum. And democratization, introduction of a democratic system to the principles of a nation. This was done in Japan. And last but not least, I don't have a bullet point for this, but I think we can handle it. If you know about the Cold War, number 10 at the bottom there, the two former World War II allies that emerged from World War II as powerful rivals with conflicting agendas. If you know anything about the Cold War, that is the United States and the Soviet Union. They fought together in World War II, and they're going to fight against each other in the Cold War afterwards.